Welcome back to Tina Romance Library, where powerful alphas fall hard, and the women they underestimate change everything. Every story here is complete, immersive, and emotion-driven. No cliffhangers, no rushed endings, just full romances you can sink into. So if you love possessive alphas, strong heroines who don't beg, slow burn tension, and emotional payoffs, you're in the right place. I need you to join the pack right now by subscribing. Leave a like if you enjoy immersive romance, and settle in because once the story begins, we don't stop until the ending. Now, let's get into it. He went into the storm-hunting trespassers, rogues who dared cross into Blackridge territory under cover of the blizzard. The wind was a living thing that night, clawing at his face, shrieking through the pines like something wild and wounded. Snow came down in sheets so thick he could barely see 5 feet ahead, but his wolf eyes cut through the white darkness, searching for movement, for threat, for blood. What he found instead stopped him cold. There, half buried in a drift near the northern ridge, was a woman curled on her side in the snow. Her body was wrapped tight around something protective, desperate, and even from 10 feet away he could see she was dying. Her lips were blue. Her skin had gone the color of frost. White hair spilled across the snow like it belonged there, like she'd been carved from winter itself. And her lashes, pale as ice, didn't even flutter when he approached. But she was still breathing. Barely. His wolf surged forward, every instinct screaming at him to move, and that's when he saw them. 6 tiny bodies. Pups. Newborns, maybe hours old, their fur still damp and matted, their eyes sealed shut. They were tucked against her stomach, pressed into the curve of her body like she was the only warmth left in the world. And she was. She'd wrapped herself around them so completely that the snow hadn't touched them, the cold hadn't reached them. She was a living shield, and she was killing herself to keep them alive. His chest cracked open. He was Kieran Hale Alpha of Blackridge, enforcer of order, the wolf other alphas whispered about when they wanted their enemies to disappear. He didn't do mercy. He didn't do soft. His pack feared him as much as they respected him, and he'd earned that fear with blood and brutality, and a kind of cold control that made grown wolves look away when he entered a room. But right now, staring down at this broken woman and her fragile pups, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Helplessness. He dropped to his knees beside her, snow soaking through his jeans, and carefully, so carefully brushed the hair back from her face. Her skin was like touching stone. She didn't respond, didn't flinch, but her arms tightened around those pups even in unconsciousness, even as her body gave out, and he realized with a jolt that she wasn't just protecting them, she was refusing to let go. That's when he saw it. Burned into the pale skin of her inner wrist, stark and ugly and unmistakable. A brand. One word, seared deep. Defect. His wolf snarled, a sound so vicious it tore up his throat, and for a moment the world went red. Someone had done this to her. Someone had marked her like cattle, like she was less than nothing, and then they'd thrown her out into a blizzard to die with her newborns. He didn't know her name, didn't know her pack, didn't know why she'd been left here, or what she'd done to deserve this. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever had done this was going to pay. He scooped her up, pups and all, cradling them against his chest as gently as his shaking hands would allow, and turned back toward Blackridge. The storm screamed around him, trying to drag him down, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because this woman had fought a blizzard and won just to keep 6 fragile lives breathing, and he'd be damned if he let her die now. She'd started something tonight, whether she knew it or not. That brand on her wrist, that single hateful word was going to ignite a firestorm, and Kieran Hale was about to burn the whole world down to find out why. Kieran Hale ruled the Northern Territory with an iron fist and a reputation that preceded him like a death knell. Blackridge wasn't just a pack, it was a fortress. A kingdom carved out of frozen wilderness and held together by fear, loyalty, and the kind of brutal efficiency that made other alphas think twice before stepping out of line. He'd built it from nothing, clawed his way to the top through challenge after challenge, each one leaving scars on his body and ice in his veins, until no wolf, no matter how strong, how ambitious, how stupid, dared question his authority. Mercy was a luxury he rarely afforded, couldn't afford. Not when weakness got you killed in the north. Not when every neighboring pack watched for cracks in his armor, waiting for the moment he slipped so they could strike. He'd learned early that kindness was a blade that cut both ways, and he'd long since decided he'd rather be feared than loved. Fear kept his wolves alive. Fear kept his borders secure. Fear was the only language the North understood. People said he didn't have a heart. He did. He just kept it buried so deep even he forgot where he'd left it most days. Locked it away behind walls of stone and steel and cold pragmatism, because an alpha who felt too much was an alpha who hesitated. And hesitation got people killed. But tonight something had shifted. He'd gone into that storm because his sentries had reported a border breach. Fresh tracks crossing into Black Ridge land, too deliberate to be accidental, too bold to be anything but a challenge. And then there was the scent. Blood. Not the sharp metallic tang of a hunt, but something deeper, desperate, wrong. His wolf had surged to the surface the moment it hit his nose, hackles raised, instincts screaming that something was out there that needed to be dealt with. He'd expected rogues, maybe a rival pack testing his defenses. He'd gone prepared to make an example of whoever had been foolish enough to cross him. He hadn't expected her. Hadn't expected 6 newborn pups fighting for every breath. Hadn't expected the way his carefully constructed control would shatter the second he saw that brand burned into her skin. His wolves were waiting when he burst through the pack house doors, snow swirling in behind him, the woman limp in his arms and the pups whimpering softly against his chest. The main hall fell silent. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward him, widening at the sight of their alpha, drenched, wild-eyed, and carrying a stranger like she was made of glass. His beta, Marcus, stepped forward first, concern etched across his scarred face. "Kieran, what? Get Dr. Lena. Now." His voice came out rougher than he intended, edged with something that might have been panic if he'd allowed himself to name it. "And clear the south wing. I want it locked down. No one gets in without my direct order." Marcus didn't question him, didn't hesitate. He just nodded once and disappeared, barking orders into his radio, and that was why Kieran trusted him. Marcus understood that some things didn't need explanation. Some things just needed to be done. Kieran moved through the hall like a man possessed, his pack parting before him, and he could feel their eyes tracking every step, could feel their confusion, their curiosity, their shock. He never brought outsiders into the pack house, never showed vulnerability, never broke protocol. But the woman in his arms was barely breathing, and those pups were so small he could feel every fragile heartbeat against his ribs, and something primal and fierce had taken root in his chest the moment he'd lifted them from the snow. He didn't understand it, didn't have time to question it. All he knew was that she'd fought a blizzard alone to keep her pups alive, and something about her absolute refusal to give up even as her body gave out had cracked something inside him he'd thought was long dead. Dr. Lena met him in the south wing, her medical bag already in hand, her expression shifting from surprise to laser-focused the instant she saw the woman's condition. "How long has she been like this?" "Don't know. Found her in the snow near the northern ridge." He laid her carefully on the bed, then tucked the pups alongside her, arranging them so they stayed pressed against her warmth. "She's hypothermic. Maybe worse. The pups are newborns, can't be more than a few hours old." Lena's hands were already moving, checking pulse points, peeling back eyelids, her mouth pressed into a grim line. "This is bad, Kieran. Her core temperature is dangerously low. If she'd been out there much longer." She wasn't. His voice came out harder than he meant, almost a growl, and Lena's eyes flicked up to meet his. He forced himself to breathe, to pull back the wolf that was suddenly too close to the surface. "Just tell me what you need." She studied him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across her face, then nodded. "Space. Time. And answers I'm guessing you don't have yet." He stepped back, watching as Lena worked, and that's when he saw it again. The brand on the woman's wrist, stark against her pale skin even in the dim light. Defect. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. That night was going to break every rule he'd ever lived by. He could feel it already, the fractures spreading through his carefully ordered world, the way everything he'd built suddenly felt fragile in the face of one unconscious woman and 6 impossibly small lives. And the worst part? He didn't want to stop it. The pups were so quiet it terrified him. Newborns were supposed to cry, supposed to squirm and mewl, and demand attention with every breath. These 6 barely moved. Their tiny chests rose and fell in shallow, irregular patterns, and their whimpers were so faint he had to strain to hear them even with his enhanced senses. They were gray, every single one of them, with the same pale, ethereal quality as their mother, like someone had leached all the color from their fur and left only shadows behind. Dr. Lena worked in focused silence, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she wrapped warming blankets around the woman's body and checked each pup with careful precision. Kieran stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, watching everything with the kind of intensity that made most wolves uncomfortable. He couldn't help it, couldn't look away. Every detail burned itself into his memory with painful clarity. The woman's fingers were the worst. Frostbitten so badly the tips had gone black, the skin split and raw where ice crystals had formed beneath the surface. She'd been clutching those pups so tightly for so long that her hands had frozen in that protective curve, and even unconscious, even as Lena worked to save her life, her fingers kept twitching toward them, reaching, searching, making sure they were still there. Her lips were blue. Not the pale blue of someone who'd been out in the cold too long, but a deep, bruised color that spoke of oxygen deprivation and a body that had been shutting down for hours. There was blood crusted at the corners of her mouth. More blood matted in her white hair, half frozen and dark against the snow-pale strands. She'd given birth alone, in a blizzard. And then she'd walked or crawled, or dragged herself. God knows how far to get away from whoever had done this to her. Kieran's eyes kept returning to that brand. He couldn't stop looking at it, couldn't stop the fury that built in his chest every time he saw that word seared into her flesh. Defect. Someone had marked her, branded her like she was broken, like she was less than nothing, and then they'd thrown her away to die. Thrown her pups away too. 6 innocent lives, hours old, condemned to freeze in the snow because their mother carried a label some bastard had burned into her skin. No Omega deserved this. He didn't care what pack laws she'd broken, what rules she'd violated, what crimes she'd supposedly committed. No wolf, no living creature deserved to be mutilated and abandoned with newborns in a blizzard. And those pups? They'd done nothing. They were guilty of nothing except being born to the wrong mother at the wrong time. The rage that coiled in his gut was different from the cold anger he usually wielded like a weapon. This was hot, personal. It made his wolf slam against his ribs, demanding blood, demanding justice, demanding he find whoever had done this and tear them apart with his bare hands. Kieran, Lena's voice cut through the red haze. She was looking at him with concern, one hand still resting on the woman's forehead. I need you to breathe. Your wolf is showing. He realized his eyes had shifted, gold bleeding into the edges of his vision, canines lengthening, claws pricking at his fingertips. He forced himself to pull it back, to shove the wolf down, but it fought him harder than it had in years. It wanted out, wanted to hunt, wanted to protect. Tell me she's going to make it, he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Lena hesitated. That pause told him everything. I don't know yet. Her body's been through severe trauma. The hypothermia alone should have killed her. The fact that she's still breathing is... She trailed off, shaking her head. She's fighting. I can tell you that much. Her vitals are weak, but they're stabilizing. The pups are stronger than they should be, given the circumstances. They must have only been born an hour or two before you found her. Which meant she'd walked through a blizzard minutes after giving birth. Had somehow found the strength to move, to run, to get her pups away from whatever hell she'd escaped. Kieran's respect for this unknown woman ratcheted up another impossible notch. What about the brand? His jaw clenched. Can you tell how old it is? Lena moved to examine the woman's wrist, her expression darkening. Recent. Maybe a day, 2 at most. Its deep second-degree burns, deliberately placed. This wasn't an accident or a punishment mark. This was meant to be permanent. She looked up at him. Someone wanted her marked for life. Someone wanted her dead. His voice came out flat, cold. The brand was just a bonus. A way to make sure if she survived, everyone would know what they thought of her. Lena didn't argue. She'd seen enough in her years as pack doctor to know how cruel wolves could be to their own. Kieran ran a hand through his hair, snowmelt dripping down his neck, and almost smiled despite everything. Dark humor was a defense mechanism he'd developed years ago, a way to cope with the weight of leadership when it threatened to crush him. "I carried 7 wolves through a blizzard tonight," he muttered. "My reputation as a heartless bastard survived. My spine barely did." Lena's lips twitched. "You carried them like they weighed nothing. They almost weighed nothing. That's the problem." He looked at the woman again, at the sharp angles of her face, the hollow of her cheeks. She'd been starving. For days, maybe weeks. Had given birth malnourished and alone, and still somehow found the strength to keep moving. "When she wakes up, I want to know who did this. I want names, packs, territories, everything." "If she wakes up," Lena corrected gently. "She will." He said it with absolute certainty, like he could will it into existence through sheer force of conviction. She didn't survive this long just to die in a warm bed. Lena studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. "You're already attached." He didn't answer, didn't need to. They both knew it was true. One of the pups whimpered a tiny, heartbreaking sound, and the woman's fingers twitched toward it even in sleep. Still reaching, still protecting. Kieran's chest tightened. He'd broken rules before, bent them when necessary. But this was different. This was going to cost him. And he was going to pay it anyway. The healers arrived within minutes, 3 of them, summoned by Marcus, each carrying supplies and wearing expressions that shifted from professional calm to horror the moment they saw what they were dealing with. Kieran stepped back to give them room, but he didn't leave. Couldn't. His wolf wouldn't let him. It paced inside his chest, agitated and protective, refusing to let the woman or her pups out of his sight. They worked in coordinated silence, hands moving with the kind of efficiency that came from years of emergency medicine. 2 focused on the pups, using warming lamps and specialized incubators designed for premature shifter births, while Lena continued working on the woman. IV lines, heated blankets, monitors that beeped steadily, tracking vitals that were still far too weak. "These pups shouldn't be alive," one of the healers murmured, a young woman named Cassie whose hands were gentle as she examined the smallest of the 6. Their core temperatures were critical. If she'd been out there even 10 more minutes... She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Kieran's hands curled into fists at his sides. 10 minutes. That's how close it had been. 10 more minutes and he would have found 7 bodies instead of 7 heartbeats. "They're stabilizing," Cassie continued, checking each pup with meticulous care. "Remarkably resilient, actually. Their mother must have..." She stopped, looking up at Kieran with something like awe in her eyes. She must have kept them so warm, so protected, that her body compensated for the cold. She was hypothermic because she gave them everything she had, every ounce of warmth, every last measure of strength. She'd poured it all into keeping them alive, and damn near killed herself doing it. Kieran felt something crack deeper in his chest. "The mother's waking," Lena said quietly, and every head in the room turned. The woman's eyelids fluttered. Her breathing changed, becoming faster, more erratic, and her fingers flexed against the sheets like she was searching for something, for her pups. Panic rippled across her face even before her eyes opened, instinct screaming that they were gone, that she'd failed, that, "They're here." Kieran moved before he thought about it, stepping to the bedside and lowering his voice to something gentler than he'd used in years. "Your pups are safe. Right here, you can see them." Her eyes snapped open and he sucked in a breath. They were pale gray, almost silver. The color of moonlight on snow, ringed with white lashes that made her look ethereal and otherworldly. Those eyes locked onto his with an intensity that punched through his defenses, and for a moment neither of them moved. She stared at him like she was trying to figure out if he was real, if this was real, if she was actually somewhere warm and safe, or if this was just another cruel dream before the end. Then her gaze slid past him to the warming stations where her pups lay bundled and breathing, and something broke in her expression. Relief. Devastating, all-consuming relief. A sob tore from her throat, raw and broken, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "They're alive," she whispered. Her voice was wrecked, hoarse from screaming or crying or both. They're alive because of you." Kieran didn't know why he said it, didn't know why it mattered that she understood what she'd done, but he needed her to know, needed her to hear it. "You kept them alive through a blizzard. You're the reason they're breathing." She closed her eyes, more tears leaking out, and her whole body seemed to collapse inward like strings had been cut. The adrenaline that had kept her moving, kept her fighting, was draining away and leaving only exhaustion and pain in its wake. Lena stepped in, professional but kind. "You're safe now. You're in Blackridge territory. My name is Dr. Lena, and I need to ask you some questions. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's eyes opened again, slower this time, and she looked at Lena with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Serafina," she said finally. The name came out barely above a whisper. "Serafina," Lena repeated, noting it down. "And your pack? Where did you come from?" Serafina's expression shuddered. Her jaw clenched, and for a moment Kieran thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, and her voice was laced with bitterness sharp enough to cut. "Silvercrest, East Territory, but I'm not pack anymore." Silvercrest. Kieran knew the name. Alpha Julian Thorne's territory, a pack known for being traditional, hierarchical, and ruthlessly efficient. They followed the old laws to the letter, and those laws had no tolerance for weakness. "Who cast you out?" The question came from Kieran, harder than he intended, and Serafina's gaze snapped to him. She studied his face, reading the anger there, and something flickered in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or fear. "My mate," she said quietly. "Alpha Julian Thorne." The room went silent. Even the healers stopped what they were doing, shock rippling through the space. An alpha casting out his own mate was rare, unthinkable in most packs. The mate bond was sacred. Breaking it required council approval, formal proceedings, witnesses. It wasn't something done lightly or in secret. But clearly, Julian Thorne hadn't cared about protocol. Why? Kieran's voice had gone dangerously soft, the kind of soft that made his wolves nervous because they knew what came after. Serafina looked at her pups, at their pale gray fur and delicate features. "Because I gave him defects," she said, and the word came out like poison. "Albino pups, 6 of them. He said they were weak, said they'd never survive their first shift, never be strong enough to serve the pack. He said I'd failed him." Failed Silvercrest. Her hands clenched in the sheets. "He ordered them culled. And when I refused, when I tried to protect them, he had me branded and thrown out. Told his wolves that if I died in the storm, it was the moon goddess's justice." Rage exploded through Kieran's chest like a detonation. His vision edged with gold, his wolf slamming forward so hard he had to lock his muscles to keep from shifting right there in the medical room. The growl that rumbled up from his chest made the healers step back, made Lena's eyes widen, made Serafina flinch despite her exhaustion. Branded, for protecting her pups, cast out to die because she'd refused to let her mate murder their children. And Julian Thorne had called it justice. Kieran forced himself to breathe, to pull the wolf back inch by brutal inch. When he spoke, his voice was ice and iron. "Did he touch them? Did he hurt your pups?" "No." Serafina's voice cracked. "I got them out before I ran the moment they were born. I knew what he'd do. I knew he wouldn't wait." She looked down at her branded wrist, at that hateful word burned into her skin. This was his parting gift. So everyone would know what I am. If this was justice, then justice needed teeth. Kieran turned to Marcus, who'd been standing silent in the doorway, taking in every word. Send word to every allied pack. I want information on Julian Thorne movements, alliances, everything. And I want our borders reinforced. If he comes looking for her, he won't find her." Marcus finished, his expression grim. "I'll handle it." Kieran looked back at Serafina. At this broken, exhausted woman who'd defied an alpha and survived a blizzard to save 6 lives her own mate had deemed worthless. "You're under my protection now," he said. "Not a request, a vow. You and your pups. No one touches you here. No one." Serafina stared at him, disbelief and hope warring in her pale eyes. "Why would you? You don't even know me." "I know enough." He held her gaze. "You're a mother who fought a blizzard. That's all I need to know. And if Julian Thorne wanted to challenge that, Kieran would be waiting." Kieran stayed in that room long after the healers finished their work and filtered out. Long after Lena declared Serafina stable and the pups out of immediate danger. Long after Marcus left to carry out his orders and the pack house settled into the quiet rhythm of late night. He told himself he was just being thorough, making sure nothing changed, keeping watch in case Julian Thorne was foolish enough to send wolves after her. But that was a lie, and he knew it. The truth was simpler and far more complicated. He couldn't leave. Serafina had fallen back into unconscious sleep, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that she knew her pups were safe. She looked impossibly fragile against the white sheets, her skin still too pale, her breathing still too shallow. One hand rested near her face, the other stretched toward the warming stations where her pups slept in their incubators. Like even in sleep she needed to know they were close. Kieran found himself watching the rise and fall of her chest, counting breaths, making sure each one came. He should leave, should let her rest, should put distance between himself and this woman who'd already disrupted his carefully ordered world more than anyone had in years. Instead, he moved closer. He told himself he was just checking the IV line, making sure the monitors were functioning properly, but his hand reached out before his brain caught up, and his fingers brushed against hers where they lay curled on the bed. The bond hit him like a lightning strike. It slammed into his chest with enough force to steal his breath, a shock of recognition so profound it drove him back a step. Heat flooded through his veins, his wolf surging forward with a possessive snarl that reverberated through his entire body. Mine. The word echoed in his head, primal and absolute. Mine, mine, mine. No. Kieran yanked his hand back like he'd been burned, his heart hammering against his ribs, his wolf clawing at his control with a desperation he'd never felt before. This wasn't possible. Couldn't be possible. Mate bonds didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were rare, sacred, and they sure as hell didn't manifest with broken strangers he'd pulled from the snow. But his wolf didn't care about logic. It knew. Had known the moment he'd touched her. Maybe even before that. Maybe as far back as when he'd first seen her curled around those pups, refusing to die. She was his mate, and she was shattered. Weak, broken, terrified, carrying trauma that would take years to heal if it ever healed at all. She'd been branded by her previous mate, cast out, left to die. She had 6 newborn pups depending on her, and a target on her back from one of the most powerful alphas in the Eastern Territories. She needed safety, stability, protection, not another alpha making claims on her before she'd even had a chance to catch her breath. Kieran pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and almost laughed. The sound came out bitter and raw. Of course. Of course his mate was the one person the world had tried to erase. Of course she showed up broken and bleeding with 6 impossible pups and a brand that made his wolf howl for vengeance. Of course fate would hand him something precious, and then wrap it in so much pain he didn't know where to start untangling it. The moon goddess had a twisted sense of humor. His wolf didn't see the complications, didn't care about timing or trauma or the fact that Serafina had just escaped one mate bond and probably wanted nothing to do with another. It just knew. Mine. Protect. Keep. Claim. And God help him. The human side wasn't far behind. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to stay, to plant himself between her and the door and dare anyone to try to get past him, to make it clear to his pack, to Julian Thorne, To the entire damn world that she was under his protection and touching her meant death. But he couldn't tell her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She'd been through too much. Needed time to heal, to recover, to figure out who she was outside of the brand someone had burned into her skin. The last thing she needed was another alpha announcing a claim before she'd even opened her eyes properly. So he'd do what he did best. He'd protect her anyway. Mate bond or not, she was in his territory now. She and her pups. That made them his responsibility. And Kieran Hale didn't take his responsibilities lightly. He moved to the window, needing distance, needing air. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in fresh snow that gleamed under the moonlight. Peaceful, beautiful, like the blizzard had never happened. But it had, and the woman sleeping behind him was proof. Behind him, one of the pups made a sound, a tiny mewling cry that was stronger than before. Kieran turned in time to see Serafina's hand twitch, her body responding to her child's voice even in sleep. The pup quieted almost immediately, sensing its mother nearby, and Serafina's breathing evened out again. Something in Kieran's chest pulled tight. She'd fought so hard for them, had given everything, her warmth, her strength, nearly her life to keep 6 fragile souls breathing, and now they were safe. All 7 of them were safe because she'd refused to quit, refused to let the cold or the dark or Julian Thorne's cruelty win. She was stronger than she looked, stronger than she probably knew, and she was his. The door opened quietly, and Marcus slipped inside, his expression carefully neutral. He took one look at Kieran standing by the window and raised an eyebrow. "You're still here." "I'm still here," Kieran confirmed, his voice rough. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then his eyes widened slightly. "Kieran, tell me you didn't—" "She's my mate." The words came out flat, final, like saying them aloud would make them more real, which it did. The bond hit the second I touched her. Marcus let out a low whistle. "Hell. Yeah." Kieran ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding into the gesture. "She doesn't know. Can't know. Not yet. You're not going to tell her? How exactly am I supposed to do that?" Kieran's voice came out sharper than he intended. "She just escaped one mate who tried to kill her pups. You think she wants to hear that Fate's decided to saddle her with another alpha before she's even had time to process what happened?" Marcus was quiet for a moment then. "So what are you going to do?" Kieran looked back at Serafina, at the brand on her wrist that made his wolf snarl every time he saw it. "I'm going to protect her. Her and her pups. I'm claiming them under pack law official protection. Full rights. No conditions. The council's going to have questions. Let them ask." Kieran's voice went cold. "She's under my protection. That's not negotiable. And if Julian Thorne comes looking for her, he's going to find out exactly what happens when someone threatens what's mine." Marcus nodded slowly. "All right, I'll make the arrangements." He paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I think she's lucky she found you." Kieran wasn't so sure about that, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He'd die before he let anyone hurt her again. The pups woke one by one over the next few hours, their tiny bodies stirring in the warming incubators, and Kieran watched each awakening with an intensity that would have embarrassed him if anyone else had been in the room. But Marcus had left to handle the council arrangements. The healers were checking other patients, and Lena had finally gone to catch a few hours of sleep. It was just him and 7 sleeping wolves, 6 of whom were about to turn his world upside down. The first to wake was the smallest a female, he thought, though it was hard to tell at this age. She made a sound somewhere between a squeak and a whimper, her tiny paws flexing against the soft bedding, and before Kieran could think better of it, he was moving to the incubator. The healer had said it was safe to hold them now that their temperatures had stabilized. Had encouraged it, actually. Skin-to-skin contact helped newborn shifters regulate their body heat and bonding. He reached in carefully, his large hands shockingly gentle, as he scooped up the pup and cradled her against his chest. She was so small, impossibly, terrifyingly small. She fit in his palm with room to spare, her body barely bigger than his fist, her fur soft as down and pale as fresh snow. Her eyes were still sealed shut, wouldn't open for another week or so. But she turned her face toward his warmth immediately, nuzzling against his shirt with tiny snuffling sounds. Something in Kieran's chest cracked wide open. He'd seen newborn pups before, had even held a few over the years when pack members brought their children to meet their alpha. But this was different. This tiny creature had survived against impossible odds, had been born in a blizzard, marked for death before she'd taken her first breath, and kept alive only by her mother's sheer determination. And now she was curling into his warmth like he was safe, like he was home. The other pups began waking in sequence, each one making soft sounds of complaint or confusion, and Kieran found himself moving between incubators, checking each one, offering a finger for them to scent or nuzzle against. They were all albino pure white fur, with the faintest hint of gray, pink noses, translucent ears, delicate and ethereal and absolutely perfect. Julian Thorne had called them defects, had ordered them killed because they didn't fit his vision of what a wolf should look like. Kieran had never wanted to kill someone more. The second pup he picked up, a male, slightly larger than his sister, immediately latched onto Kieran's finger with his mouth. No teeth yet, just gums and determination. But the little beast bit down with surprising strength and refused to let go. Kieran stared at the pup, clinging to his finger, and felt a smile tug at his mouth despite everything. "You've got spirit," he murmured. "I'll give you that." The pup growled. Actually growled. A sound barely louder than a buzz, but unmistakably defiant. Kieran's smile widened. He'd faced armies, had stared down challengers twice his size without flinching, had killed rogues with his bare hands and never lost a moment's sleep over it. This tiny creature biting his finger with toothless determination was somehow worse, because it was adorable. And Kieran Hale did not do adorable, except apparently he did now. He gently extracted his finger and settled the pup back in the incubator, then moved to check the others. 4 more, 2 males, 2 females if he was reading the sense right, each one perfect and whole and fiercely alive despite everything they'd been through. They were already showing personality. One was calm and sleepy. Another was vocal, making tiny yipping sounds that would probably turn into howls later. The third kept trying to climb out of the incubator despite not having the coordination yet, and they were all imprinting on him. Kieran could feel it happening, that instinctive recognition that happened between pack and pups. They were scenting him, learning his presence, cataloging him as safe, as family. Their tiny bodies relaxed when he came close, and they turned toward him when he spoke, already associating his voice with protection. It should have terrified him, should have sent him running, because getting attached to 6 pups that weren't his, that belonged to his unconscious mate, who didn't even know about the bond yet, was asking for complications he didn't need. But he couldn't stop. Didn't want to stop. These pups had stolen his heart before he'd had a chance to guard it. "You're going to be trouble," he told them quietly, checking each incubator one more time. "All 6 of you. I can already tell." Behind him, sheets rustled. A sharp intake of breath. Kieran turned to find Serafina awake, her pale eyes wide and locked on him standing near her pups. Fear flickered across her face, raw and immediate, and she tried to push herself upright despite the IV lines and her body's obvious weakness. "Please," her voice cracked. "Please don't hurt them. I'll go. I'll leave. Just don't." "I'm not going to hurt them." Kieran kept his voice low, calm, the same tone he'd use with a spooked animal. He moved away from the incubators slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. "I was checking on them. They're all awake and healthy." She didn't believe him. He could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the sheets like she was preparing to throw herself out of bed and fight him despite having no strength left. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to reveal that his protection came with conditions, that safety had a price, that he'd saved her pups only to use them against her. Because that's what Julian had taught her to expect. The thought made Kieran's wolf snarl. He forced himself to stay still, to give her space. "My name is Kieran Hale. You're in Blackridge territory, the Northern Pack. You've been under medical care for about 6 hours. Your pups are stable. You're stable. and no one here is going to hurt you." "Why?" The question came out sharp, suspicious. "Why would you help us? You don't know me. Don't know what he said. I don't care what he said." Kieran's voice came out harder than he intended, and he saw her flinch. He gentled his tone with effort. "I found you in the snow protecting your pups. That's all I needed to know. You're a mother who fought a blizzard and won. That earns my respect, and my protection." She stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Like the concept of protection without conditions was so foreign she couldn't process it. God, what had Julian done to her? "I've claimed you and your pups under pack law," Kieran continued. "Official protection, full rights. You're under Blackridge's shield now, which means no one touches you. Not Julian Thorne, not his pack, not anyone." He held her gaze, letting her see the truth in his eyes. "No one touches you, not ever again. That's my promise." Serafina's breath hitched. Tears welled in her pale eyes, spilling over, and she pressed a hand to her mouth like she was trying to hold back a sob. "Why?" she whispered again. "Why would you do that for someone like me?" "Because someone like you survived the impossible," Kieran said simply, "and that's worth protecting." One of the pups made a sound, the little male who'd bitten his finger, and Serafina's head snapped toward the incubators. Her whole body seemed to reach for them, even though she was too weak to move. "Do you want to hold them?" Kieran asked. The hope that flashed across her face was almost painful to witness. "Can I? They're yours." He moved to the nearest incubator. "Of course you can." Kieran lifted the pups one by one and brought them to Serafina, arranging them carefully on the bed around her. She was still too weak to hold them all at once, so he helped position them against her sides, tucked into the curve of her body where they belonged. Her hands trembled as she touched them, stroking their soft fur with a gentleness that spoke of wonder and disbelief, like she couldn't quite accept that they were real, that they were safe, that this wasn't some cruel dream. The pups responded immediately, nuzzling into her warmth, their tiny bodies relaxing completely. One of them let out a satisfied squeak, and Serafina laughed a broken, watery sound that turned into a sob halfway through. Kieran stayed close, watching her cradle the lives she'd nearly died to protect, and felt the mate bond pull tighter in his chest. Every instinct demanded he touch her, comfort her, make that devastated expression disappear from her face. But he forced himself to stay back, to give her this moment with her pups without his presence overwhelming it. The peaceful scene shattered when Marcus burst through the door. His beta's expression was grim, a tablet clutched in one hand and tension radiating from every line of his body. "Kieran, we have a problem." Kieran was on his feet immediately, moving to intercept Marcus before whatever news he carried could reach Serafina. "What is it?" Marcus glanced past him to where Serafina sat with her pups, then lowered his voice. "Julian Thorne just filed a formal complaint with the Northern Council. He's claiming Serafina committed treason against Silvercrest and fled with stolen pack property." Ice flooded Kieran's veins. "Stolen property? The pups." Marcus's jaw clenched. "He's claiming they belong to Silvercrest pack, and that she had no right to remove them from his territory. He's demanding we return her and the pups for proper judgment." The growl that tore from Kieran's chest was purely wolf-deep and vicious enough to make Marcus take a step back. Behind him, he heard Serafina's sharp intake of breath, heard the pups whimper in response to the sudden tension flooding the room. "He's a council, Alpha," Marcus continued, his voice tight. "He has political weight, and he's not just making a request, he's threatening sanctions if we don't comply. Says our harboring of a criminal constitutes an act of aggression against his pack." "Let him threaten." Kieran's voice came out cold enough to frost the air. "She's under my protection. End of discussion." "It's not that simple." Marcus pulled up something on the tablet, his expression darkening further. He sent evidence to support his claim, documentation of Serafina's crimes, and he's rallying other council alphas to his side, painting this as a matter of pack law and territorial sovereignty. Kieran snatched the tablet from Marcus's hands and started scrolling through the files Julian had submitted. Each one made his blood boil hotter. Formal charges of insubordination, claims that Serafina had repeatedly defied direct orders, accusations of instability, of being unfit for pack life, of posing a danger to Silvercrest's hierarchy. And then buried in the documentation like it was nothing, execution orders, dated the night of the pup's birth, signed by Julian Thorne himself. Orders to cull the pups immediately upon delivery. Orders to brand Serafina as defective and exile her to ensure she couldn't contaminate other packs with her genetics. It was all there. In writing, Julian had documented his own cruelty, probably thinking no one would ever question an alpha's right to manage his own pack however he saw fit. "This isn't evidence of her crimes," Kieran said, his voice deadly quiet. "This is a confession of his." Marcus nodded grimly. "I know, but he's framing it as proof that she violated pack law by refusing a direct command and stealing pack assets. Some of the other alphas are buying it, or at least pretending to. They don't want to set a precedent of outside packs interfering in internal discipline. Discipline. The word tasted like poison. He tried to murder 6 newborns and called it discipline. "I'm not arguing with you," Marcus said carefully. "I'm telling you what we're up against. Julian has allies. He has political influence. And he's turning this into a question of whether you have the right to override another alpha's judgment within his own territory." Behind them, Serafina spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's going to start a war." Both alphas turned. She was pale as death, her arms wrapped protectively around her pups, her pale eyes fixed on Kieran with something like devastation. "He'll use this as an excuse," she continued, her voice gaining strength even as her hands shook. "He wanted me gone anyway, wanted the pups dead. But if he can twist this into a territorial dispute, if he can make it look like you're harboring criminals and undermining council authority," she closed her eyes, "he'll rally the other packs, force them to choose sides, and people will die because I—" "Stop!" Kieran crossed the room in 3 strides, his presence commanding enough to cut through her spiral. "People will die because Julian Thorne is a monster who brands omegas and orders newborns executed. None of this is your fault. But if I leave," her voice cracked, "if I take the pups and go, if I just disappear, then there's no reason for— Running didn't save you before." Kieran's voice came out harder than he meant, frustration bleeding through. He gentled it with effort. "You ran through a blizzard and nearly died. You think disappearing now will make Julian stop? You think he'll just let this go?" She flinched but didn't look away. "At least no one else would get hurt. You would get hurt." The words came out raw, pulled from somewhere deep in his chest where the mate bond coiled tight and possessive. "You and your pups. He'd hunt you down, Serafina, you know he would. And next time there won't be someone to pull you from the snow." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her jaw set with stubborn determination. "That's my choice to make. Not anymore." Kieran held her gaze, letting her see the absolute conviction in his eyes. "You're under my protection. That means I decide what threats I'm willing to face. And I'm telling you right now, I'd rather face war than hand you back to the bastard who did this to you." "Why?" The question burst from her like she couldn't hold it back anymore. "Why would you risk your pack, your position, everything you've built for someone you don't even know? It doesn't make sense." "Because you're my mate," his wolf howled. "Because I'd burn the whole world down before I let anyone hurt you again." But he couldn't say that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So he told her a different truth. One that was just as real. Because what Julian did was wrong. Because those pups deserve to live. Because you fought harder than any wolf I've ever seen to protect them. And that kind of courage deserves to be honored, not punished. His voice dropped. "And because I meant what I said, no one touches you. Not ever again." Serafina stared at him, something shifting behind her pale eyes. Hope, maybe. Or the terrifying possibility of trust. Marcus cleared his throat. "The council is demanding a formal hearing. 3 days from now. Julian will present his case. We'll present ours. And the council will make a ruling." Kieran didn't take his eyes off Serafina. "Then we have 3 days to build a defense that buries him." He finally turned to Marcus. "Get me everything pack records, territorial laws, precedents for mate rejection and pup abandonment. I want every piece of leverage we can find. Already on it, Marcus confirmed. But Kieran, if the council rules in his favor, they won't. He said it with absolute certainty, like he could will it into existence through sheer force of conviction. Because I'm not giving them a choice. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded and left. The room fell into heavy silence. Serafina looked down at her pups, her expression tortured. One of them, the fierce little male, was chewing on her finger, completely oblivious to the political storm brewing around him. I don't want anyone to die for me, she whispered. Kieran moved closer, crouching beside the bed so he could meet her eyes at the same level. Then don't die for anyone else. Stay. Fight. Let me help you. I don't know how to do that. Her voice broke. I don't know how to let someone help. Then learn. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her hand where it rested on the bed. The mate bond flared between them, and he saw her eyes widen slightly, felt her sharp intake of breath. She felt it too, maybe didn't understand what it was, but she felt something. 3 days, he said softly. Give me 3 days to prove Julian wrong. Can you do that? She looked at her pups, at their tiny, perfect bodies and soft white fur, at the lives she'd nearly sacrificed everything to save. Then she looked back at Kieran and nodded. 3 days. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. Kieran barely slept, spending every waking hour gathering evidence, building their case, and reinforcing Blackridge's defenses in case Julian decided to escalate beyond legal channels. Marcus coordinated with allied packs, calling in favors and securing testimonies from wolves who'd fled Silvercrest over the years. The picture they were building was damning a pattern of cruelty, of omegas abused and discarded, of pups deemed imperfect, who'd disappeared without explanation. Julian Thorne had been getting away with this for years. Not anymore. Serafina recovered slowly, her strength returning in increments that frustrated her but didn't surprise Kieran. Her body had been through hell. The fact that she was walking at all after 3 days was a testament to her resilience. She spent most of her time with the pups, rarely leaving the medical wing, speaking only when spoken to. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for Kieran to reveal some hidden agenda, some price for his protection. He hated that she expected betrayal. Hated that Julian had broken her trust so thoroughly she couldn't imagine safety without conditions. But he kept his distance. Checked on her and the pups regularly but didn't push for conversation, didn't demand anything from her except that she rest and heal. The mate bond pulled at him constantly, a living ache in his chest that grew worse every time he walked away from her room. But he endured it. She needed space, needed time. He could give her that much. What he couldn't give her was complete safety. Because on the second night, someone tried to kill her. It was one of the pups that saved her life. The fierce little male who'd bitten Kieran's finger. The one who seemed to have appointed himself guardian of his siblings despite being barely 3 days old. He'd been sleeping peacefully in the incubator when the door to Serafina's room opened quietly just past midnight, the night nurse coming in to check vitals. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, except the pup woke up and immediately started screaming. Not the normal whimpering of a hungry newborn, but full-throated distress calls that tore through the quiet medical wing like an alarm. His siblings joined in within seconds, 6 tiny voices rising in panic, and the noise brought the guards running. They burst through the door to find the nurse, a woman named Helen who'd been with Blackridge for 5 years, who'd helped deliver half the pack's pups, who everyone trusted standing over Serafina's bed with a syringe in her hand. Serafina was unconscious, sedated for the night so her body could heal, completely defenseless. Helen had the needle positioned over the IV port, seconds away from injecting whatever poison she'd brought. The guards tackled her before she could press the plunger. Kieran arrived 90 seconds later, summoned by the mind link from his head of security, and the rage that consumed him when he saw what had almost happened was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. His wolf surged forward, demanding blood, demanding justice, demanding he tear Helen apart right there for daring to threaten his mate. He forced it down through sheer will, his voice coming out cold and deadly when he spoke. Explain, now. Helen was pinned to the floor by 2 guards, the syringe confiscated and sealed in evidence. She looked up at Kieran with defiance despite her compromised position. She's a danger to all of us. Defective bloodlines, cursed pups, she'll poison Blackridge just like she poisoned Silvercrest. Alpha Thorn was right to cast her out. Alpha Thorn paid you. It wasn't a question. Kieran could see it in her eyes, in the way she wouldn't quite meet his gaze. How much? Helen's jaw clenched. She didn't answer. Marcus appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, his expression thunderous. Found the transfer. 50,000. Moved through 3 intermediary accounts to hide the source. It hit her account yesterday. 50,000 to murder an Omega and 6 newborn pups. Kieran's hands curled into fists so tight his claws drew blood from his own palms. You've been with this pack for 5 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You've delivered our pups, healed our wounded, sat at our table, and you were willing to murder a defenseless woman and her children for money. For the good of the pack, Helen spat. You're too blind to see what she is, what she'll bring down on us. The council won't side with you, they'll force you to hand her over, and when you refuse, Silvercrest will have justification for war. She's not worth it. Kieran moved so fast Helen didn't have time to flinch. He was crouched in front of her, his face inches from hers, his wolf pressing so close to the surface his eyes had gone full gold. You don't get to decide what's worth protecting in my territory. You don't get to play executioner in my house, and you sure as hell don't get to hurt children and call it righteousness. He straightened, nodding to the guards. Take her to the holding cells. Full isolation. I'll deal with her after the council hearing. They dragged Helen away, still protesting, still insisting she'd done the right thing. Kieran didn't watch her go. His attention was already on Serafina, on making sure the sedative was all that was in her system, that Helen hadn't managed to inject anything before the guards arrived. Dr. Lena rushed in, looking rumpled and furious, and immediately began checking Serafina's vitals. She's fine, she announced after a tense minute. Whatever was in that syringe didn't make it into her bloodstream. The pups alerted the guards in time. Kieran looked at the incubators, at 6 tiny wolves who were finally settling down now that the threat had passed. The fierce little male was still watching the door. His sightless eyes pointed toward where Helen had been dragged away, his tiny body tense and alert. Turns out tiny wolves made excellent security systems. The thought almost made him smile despite the adrenaline still flooding his system. Almost. I want guards on this room around the clock, he ordered. 2 minimum, rotated every 6 hours. No one gets in without explicit clearance from me, Marcus, or Lena. And I want background checks run on every staff member who's had access to this wing. Marcus was already making notes. Done. But Kieran, if Helen was willing to take Julian's money, there might be others. I know. The words tasted bitter. One traitor was bad enough. The possibility of more made his wolf snarl with protective fury. Which is why we're moving them. Lena looked up sharply. Moving them where? My private quarters. He could feel both of them staring at him, could practically hear the questions forming. He didn't care. It's the most secure location in the compound. Reinforced walls, limited access, guards I've personally trained. If Julian wants to try again, he'll have to go through me first. Kieran, Marcus said carefully. Moving her into your personal space is going to raise questions. The pack will talk. Let them talk. His voice came out harder than he intended, edged with the kind of authority that made wolves lower their eyes. Serafina and her pups are under my direct protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally. Marcus held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. Something knowing flickered in his beta's eyes, but he didn't voice it. I'll arrange the transfer. Kieran looked down at Serafina, still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that she'd come within seconds of death. His chest tightened. The mate bond screamed at him to stay, to guard her himself, to never let her out of his sight again. But there was one more thing he needed to do first. He pulled Marcus aside, lowering his voice. The money trail. I want you to follow it all the way back. Every account, every transfer, every connection between Helen and Julian. Because I'm willing to bet this isn't the only thing he's been paying for. Marcus's expression darkened with understanding. You think there's more? I know there's more. Kieran glanced back at Serafina, at the brand on her wrist that was still healing. Men like Julian don't operate in isolation. He's been getting away with this for too long, too smoothly. Someone's been helping him. Someone's been covering his tracks. I'll find them, Marcus promised. Good. Kieran's voice went cold. Because when we walk into that council hearing tomorrow, I want every secret Julian Thorne has buried dragged into the light. And then he wanted to watch the bastard burn. The council chamber was built to intimidate. High stone walls carved with the names of every alpha who'd ever ruled in the Northern Territories. A circular floor where accused and accuser stood exposed under the weight of judgment. 12 seats arranged in a semicircle, each occupied by an alpha whose word could shape the fate of entire packs. And in the center of it all stood Julian Thorne. He looked exactly how Kieran had imagined. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of polished presentation that came from years of political maneuvering. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit expensive, his expression carefully arranged into righteous indignation. He played the part of wronged alpha perfectly, standing with his hands clasped behind his back like a man confident in his position. Kieran wanted to rip his throat out. He stood on the opposite side of the circle, Marcus at his right shoulder, and between them, because Kieran had insisted, despite the council's protests, was Serafina. She'd refused to hide, had insisted on facing Julian herself, on making sure he saw that she'd survived, that her pups had survived, that his attempt to erase them had failed. She wore simple clothes borrowed from the pack house, her white hair pulled back to fully expose the brand on her wrist. She wasn't trying to hide what had been done to her. She was weaponizing it. Kieran had never been more proud of someone in his life. The head counselor, an ancient alpha named Garrett, whose scars spoke of battles fought before Kieran was born, called the hearing to order. "We are here to address the complaint filed by Alpha Julian Thorne of Silvercrest regarding the harboring of a criminal and the theft of pack property by Alpha Kieran Hale of Blackridge. Alpha Thorne, present your case." Julian stepped forward, his voice smooth and practiced. "Thank you, counselor. I come before you seeking justice for a grave violation of pack law and territorial sovereignty. The woman standing beside Alpha Hale is Serafina Thorne, my former mate. She was cast from Silvercrest for repeated acts of insubordination and for bearing defective offspring that posed a danger to pack integrity. By pack law, and by my authority as Alpha, I ordered those pups culled and Serafina exiled. Instead, she fled with them, stealing what rightfully belonged to Silvercrest. Alpha Hale has refused to return her despite my formal request, thereby, show them your wrist." Kieran's voice cut through Julian's prepared speech like a blade. The chamber fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Kieran didn't look at the council. He looked at Julian, watching the micro-expression that flickered across the other alpha's face. Surprise, then calculation, then carefully controlled anger. "I'm sorry?" Julian's tone was polite, but his eyes had gone cold. "Your mate's wrist." Kieran kept his voice level, conversational, like he was discussing the weather. "You ordered her branded. Show the council what you had burned into her skin." Julian's jaw tightened. "That mark was applied in accordance with pack law. Show them." The command in Kieran's voice made several of the counselors sit up straighter. This wasn't a request. It was a challenge, delivered in front of witnesses who couldn't ignore it. Serafina stepped forward before Julian could respond. She held up her wrist, turning slowly so every counselor could see the words seared into her flesh. "Defect." The reaction was immediate. Several counselors leaned forward, their expressions shifting from neutral to disturbed. One, a female alpha named Mira, actually stood from her seat, her eyes fixed on the brand with undisguised horror. "You branded your mate?" Mira's voice was sharp enough to cut. "Your Omega? The mother of your children?" "She violated," Julian started. "Answer the question," Garrett interrupted, his ancient eyes boring into Julian. "Did you order this mark placed on your mate's body?" Julian's mask slipped for just a second. Kieran saw it, the flash of rage, of entitlement, of a man who'd never expected to be questioned. "I did. It was necessary to. There is no necessity that justifies this." Mira's voice shook with barely contained fury. "Branding is reserved for rogues, for traitors who've committed acts of violence against pack members. What did she do that warranted being marked like cattle? She bore defective pups." Julian's voice had gone hard, defensive. 6 albino offspring who would never survive their first shift, who would drain pack resources and weaken our bloodline. I ordered them culled for the good of Silvercrest, and she refused a direct alpha command. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Marcus stepped forward, tablet in hand. "Counselors, we'd like to submit evidence." What followed was systematic destruction. Marcus presented everything they'd found. Bank records showing payments to Helen and 3 other wolves in different packs, all traceable back to Julian. Testimony from former Silvercrest members who'd fled after watching their own pups disappear for being imperfect. Medical records that had been sealed but recovered through allied contacts, showing a pattern of forced terminations and suspicious deaths among Omega mothers. And then the final piece, the one that made Julian's face go white. A video recording, grainy but clear enough, showing Julian in his office discussing payment for someone to handle the albino problem permanently if Serafina managed to escape the blizzard. He'd planned the assassination, had ordered Helen to kill Serafina and the pups as a backup if exposure didn't finish the job. The council chamber erupted. Garrett slammed his hand on the table, the crack of sound cutting through the chaos. Alpha Thorn, you stand accused of conspiracy to commit murder, of hiring assassins across pack boundaries, of systematic abuse of Omega members, and of gross violation of mate bond sanctity. How do you answer these charges? Julian's composure finally shattered. Those pups were abominations. She defied me. I had every right. You had no right. Mira was on her feet, shaking with rage. No alpha has the right to murder children. No mate has the right to brand and exile their Omega for protecting her young. You're a disgrace to your title. I demand a formal challenge, Kieran said, his voice cutting through the noise. Every eye turned to him. For crimes against an Omega under my protection, for attempted murder of pack members within my territory, and for gross violations of pack law. I challenged Julian Thorn to alpha combat. The chamber went dead silent. Alpha challenges were rare, sacred, and binding. Julian stared at him, calculation flickering behind his eyes. He was older than Kieran, more experienced, with a reputation for viciousness in combat. He thought he could win. I accept, he said. They moved outside to the combat circle, an ancient ring carved into stone where alphas had settled disputes for generations. Wolves from every pack in attendance formed a perimeter, watching with hungry eyes. This was what they'd come for. Not politics or legal arguments, but blood and dominance, and the primal resolution of alpha against alpha. Kieran stripped off his shirt, feeling his wolf press against his skin, eager and ready. Across the circle, Julian did the same, his body corded with muscle and covered in scars from previous challenges. Garrett raised his hand. This is alpha combat. First blood establishes dominance. Submission or death ends it. Begin. They shifted simultaneously. Kieran's wolf was massive black as midnight, with gold eyes that burned with protective fury. Julian's was slightly smaller, brown and scarred, but fast. They circled each other, snarling, looking for openings. Julian struck first. A blur of motion aimed at Kieran's throat. But Kieran had been fighting since he was old enough to shift, had earned his position through countless challenges, and he'd spent the last 3 days imagining this exact moment. He caught Julian mid-leap and slammed him into the ground hard enough to crack stone. What followed wasn't elegant. Wasn't the careful tactical combat of two experienced alphas testing each other's strengths. It was brutal, vicious, and one-sided. Kieran fought with the rage of a mate protecting his own, and Julian, for all his experience, had never faced that kind of primal fury before. Within minutes, Julian was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his movements getting slower, more desperate. He tried to rally, tried to use his experience to find an advantage, but Kieran was relentless. Every time Julian got close to Serafina's position in the crowd, Kieran drove him back with savage efficiency. Finally, Kieran had him pinned, jaws around Julian's throat, one wrong move away from death. Julian went still. Submission. Kieran held him there for 3 long seconds, making sure every wolf watching understood who had won, who was stronger, who had the right to pass judgment. Then he released him and shifted back to human form, standing over Julian's bleeding wolf with cold satisfaction. Shift, he commanded. Julian obeyed, his human form bruised and broken, blood streaming from cuts across his chest and shoulders. Kieran looked up at the council, at Garrett, who watched with ancient eyes. I claim victory, and I demand punishment befitting his crimes. Garrett nodded slowly. The council recognizes Kieran Hale's victory. Julian Thorn, you are hereby stripped of your alpha title, your pack, and all authority you held. The mate bond you violated is declared null and void. You are exiled from the Northern Territories and marked as Oathbreaker. 2 wolves came forward with a branding iron. Julian's eyes went wide with horror. No, you can't. You marked your mate, Mira said coldly. Now wear your own mark, so everyone knows what you are. They held him down and pressed the iron to his shoulder. The symbol that marked cowards and oathbreakers, visible to every wolf who saw him. His screams echoed across the combat circle. When it was done, they released him. He collapsed, sobbing, broken in ways that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. Kieran looked at Serafina. She was watching Julian with an expression he couldn't read. Not satisfaction, not revenge. Just exhaustion. Like she'd been carrying this weight for so long and finally it was done. "It's over," he said quietly. She met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd found her in the snow, he saw something like peace flicker across her face. "It's over," she agreed. The journey back to Blackridge was quiet. Serafina sat beside Kieran in the SUV, the pups secured in specialized carriers between them, and neither spoke much. There wasn't need for words yet. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was the kind of quiet that came after a storm, when the world was still catching its breath and everything felt fragile and new. Kieran kept glancing at her from the corner of his eye, watching the way she stared out the window at the passing landscape. She looked different. Not physically, she was still too thin, still healing, still carrying the brand on her wrist that would never fully fade. But something in her posture had changed. The constant tension that had kept her shoulders rigid, that had made her flinch at sudden movements, had eased. Not gone. Probably wouldn't be gone for a long time, but lighter. She'd faced her demon and walked away free. They arrived at the pack house just as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered compound in shades of gold and pink. Pack members had gathered to greet them, word of the council's ruling had spread fast, and every wolf in Blackridge knew what had happened. What Kieran had done. What it meant. Their alpha had claimed an Omega and her pups, had gone to war with a council alpha to protect them, had won. The pack's response would tell Kieran everything he needed to know about whether they'd accept this, whether they'd follow him down this path he'd chosen. Marcus opened Serafina's door, offering his hand to help her down. She took it hesitantly, then stepped out into the cold evening air. Her pale eyes swept across the assembled wolves, and Kieran saw the moment fear crept back in. She was waiting for judgment, for rejection, for someone to voice what Julian had told her, that she was defective, that her pups were worthless, that she didn't deserve to be here. Instead, the pack bowed. Every single wolf lowered their head in a gesture of respect and acceptance. Not submission that was reserved for their alpha, but acknowledgement. "Welcome." Serafina's breath caught, her hand flew to her mouth, and tears spilled down her cheeks for what felt like the 100th time in the past few days. But these were different. These were relief and gratitude, and the overwhelming realization that maybe, finally, she'd found somewhere safe. Kieran moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and grounding. "They're not bowing to me," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "They're bowing to you. You survived what shouldn't be survivable. You protected your pups against impossible odds. That earns respect here." "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything." He touched her lower back gently, guiding her toward the pack house. "Come on, let's get the pups settled." The private quarters Kieran had prepared for her were on the same floor as his own rooms, close enough that he could reach her in seconds if needed, private enough that she didn't feel watched. The space was larger than necessary, with a dedicated nursery already set up with 6 cribs, warming stations, and every supply the pups could possibly need. Serafina stood in the doorway, taking it all in, and something in her expression crumbled. "You did all this? For us?" "Marcus helped," Kieran said, deflecting because the gratitude in her voice was almost too much to handle. "And Lena consulted on the medical equipment. But yeah, it's yours, for as long as you want it." She turned to look at him, really look at him, and the question in her eyes was clear even if she didn't voice it. Why? Why this much? Why this far? Kieran knew he should tell her. Should explain about the mate bond, about what he'd felt the moment he'd touched her hand 3 days ago. But the words stuck in his throat because what if she wasn't ready? What if knowing pushed her away before they'd even had a chance to? "I can feel it," Serafina said softly, cutting through his spiraling thoughts. "The bond. I didn't understand what it was at first, but I do now. I felt it during the challenge. When you were fighting Julian, I felt every hit like it was my own. Felt your rage and your protectiveness and..." She trailed off, her pale eyes searching his face. "You're my mate." Kieran's heart stopped, then started again, harder. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "I am." "Since when?" "Since the moment I touched your hand in the medical room." He forced himself to hold her gaze, to let her see the truth. "I felt the bond snap into place and I knew. But you just escaped one mate who'd hurt you. I didn't want to push. Didn't want to make you feel trapped or obligated or..." "I don't feel trapped," She took a step closer, and the air between them suddenly felt charged. Electric. I feel safe. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I feel safe. And I know that's you. I know it's the bond, but it's also who you are. What you've done. How you've protected us without asking for anything in return. I'm asking now. The words came out before Kieran could stop them, pulled from somewhere deep and desperate. Stay. Not because of the bond, not because you owe me, but because you want to. You and the pups. Stay here. Let me protect you. Let me... He stopped himself before he said too much, before the emotion building in his chest spilled over into something he couldn't take back. Serafina reached out and took his hand. The mate bond flared between them, warm and right and absolutely certain. I want to stay, she said. I choose this. I choose you. Something in Kieran's chest that had been locked tight for years finally broke open. He pulled her into his arms carefully, mindful of her still healing body, and held her like she was precious, like she was his. Because she was. She wrapped her arms around him and buried her face against his chest, and they stood there in the doorway while the pups slept peacefully behind them, and the future stretched out uncertain but possible. The council recognized the pups, Kieran said after a long moment, declared them legitimate heirs with full pack rights. They're not just protected now, they're honored, and when they're old enough, if they want, they can be named as my successors. Serafina pulled back to look at him, shock written across her face. You'd do that? Name them as heirs? They're yours. That makes them mine. And they're strong, I can already see it. That fierce little male who bit my finger, he's going to be a force of nature when he grows up. Kieran smiled, genuine warmth flooding through him. Besides, albino wolves are going to become a symbol of strength in Blackridge, a reminder that survival matters more than appearance, that courage is worth more than conformity. Tears welled in Serafina's eyes again. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. For saving us. For fighting for us. For making us matter. You've always mattered. Kieran cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away her tears. You just needed someone to see it. She leaned into his touch, and the bond between them pulsed with warmth and promise and the beginning of something that could, with time, become everything. Behind them, one of the pups started fussing the fierce little male, of course. Serafina laughed, the sound watery but genuine, and went to tend to him. Kieran watched her lift the pup with practiced ease, watched the way he immediately settled against her warmth, and felt something shift permanently in his chest. His ruthless reign had ended the day 6 pups decided he was a climbing tree. The day an Omega with white hair and survival in her bones had stumbled into his territory and turned his entire world upside down. And he wouldn't change a single second of it. Marcus appeared in the doorway, a knowing smile playing at his lips. The pack's asking when they can officially meet the pups, and whether we should start planning a mating ceremony. Kieran looked at Serafina, raising an eyebrow in question. She was blushing, her pale skin going pink, but she nodded. When I'm ready, she said. When we're both ready. But yes, eventually. Eventually works, Kieran agreed. Marcus grinned. I'll let them know. And Kieran? He paused. She's good for you. You both are. All 7 of them. After Marcus left, Serafina settled into the rocking chair with the pup, and Kieran stood watching her, his mate, his Omega, or his future, and realized that somewhere between finding her in the snow and standing here now, he'd stopped being just an alpha. He'd become something more. He'd become hers. And that was worth more than any throne, any title, any reputation he'd ever built. The pup yawned, showing toothless gums, and Serafina smiled down at him with such tenderness it made Kieran's throat tight. We need to name them, she said softly. You should choose, Kieran said, moving to sit on the arm of the chair beside her. She shook her head. We'll choose together. They're ours now. All of us. One family. One family. The words settled over Kieran like a benediction, like the answer to a question he hadn't known he'd been asking his entire life. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle this time, peaceful, covering the compound in fresh white. A new beginning, a clean slate. And inside, surrounded by warmth and pups, and the woman who'd somehow become his entire world in the span of 3 days, Kieran Hale finally understood what it meant to be complete. Spring came to Blackridge like a whisper, melting the snow inch by inch and revealing the earth beneath. The compound transformed from a fortress of ice and stone into something softer green pushing through the thaw, streams running clear and cold, the air carrying the scent of pine and possibility. Kieran stood on the balcony of his quarters, watching the packlands wake from winter, and felt the difference in his bones. Not just the season changing, but everything. His entire world had shifted on its axis, and he was still adjusting to the weight of it, the magnificent, terrifying weight of having something precious to lose. Behind him, inside the warmth of their shared space, he could hear laughter, Serafina's voice, bright and unguarded in a way that still caught him off guard sometimes. And beneath it, the higher-pitched sounds of 6 pups who were no longer newborns but growing wolves with personalities that got bigger and bolder every day. 4 months. That's all it had been since he'd found her in the snow. 4 months that felt like a lifetime and no time at all. The fierce little male Storm, they'd named him, had indeed grown into a force of nature. He was the first to shift, the first to howl, the first to challenge his siblings to wrestles that usually ended with someone crying and Serafina separating them with patient firmness. His sisters Luna, Frost, and River were gentler but no less determined, already showing the kind of quiet strength that would make them formidable when they grew. And the 2 remaining males, Ash and Silver, were inseparable, moving through the world as a unit, finishing each other's sentences in that way young pups did before they learned they were separate beings. All 6 of them were thriving, growing stronger every day, their white fur gleaming, their eyes bright with intelligence and mischief. The pack had fallen in love with them immediately, treating them like precious treasures, and the pups soaked up the attention like it was their birthright, which, Kieran supposed, it was. They were heirs to Blackridge now, protected and honored and completely spoiled by wolves who'd once thought their alpha incapable of softness. He'd proven them wrong spectacularly. The door opened behind him, and Serafina stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cool morning air. She moved to stand beside him, and Kieran automatically wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. The mate bond hummed between them, settled and content in a way that still amazed him. They'd completed the mating ceremony a month ago, a quiet affair with just the pack's inner circle, because Serafina didn't want spectacle, just commitment, just forever. And Kieran had given her exactly that. "They're destroying your office," she said, amusement coloring her voice. "Storm knocked over your filing cabinet trying to climb it. Ash and Silver are playing tug-of-war with what I think used to be an important document. And the girls are seeing who can howl the loudest." Kieran groaned, but he was smiling. "Marcus is going to kill me when he sees the damage. Marcus adores them. He'll just give you that disapproving look, and then sneak them treats when he thinks we're not watching." She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "We should probably stop them before they actually succeed in bringing down the cabinet." "Probably," Kieran agreed. But he didn't move. Neither did she. They stood there in the morning light, watching spring reclaim the world, and the peace between them was so complete it felt almost sacred. "I never thought I'd have this," Serafina said quietly. "A mate who sees me, pups who are safe and loved, a home where I don't have to be afraid." She tilted her head to look up at him, her pale eyes reflecting the sunrise. "Thank you. For all of it. For choosing us." Kieran cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "You saved yourself," he said. "You walked through a blizzard and refused to die. I just gave you somewhere safe to land. You gave us everything," she corrected softly. He kissed her then, slow and gentle, the bond flaring warm between them. When they pulled apart, her smile was radiant, and Kieran felt that now familiar tightening in his chest, the overwhelming knowledge that this woman, these pups, this life they were building together was worth more than anything he'd ever accomplished. A crash from inside made them both wince. "Definitely the filing cabinet," Serafina sighed. They went back inside together to find chaos papers scattered everywhere. Storm standing triumphantly atop the fallen cabinet, the girls mid-howl, and Ash and Silver engaged in a vicious battle over what had definitely been an important treaty document. Kieran surveyed the destruction and couldn't help but laugh. His ruthless reputation was in absolute shambles. His office looked like a war zone, and he'd never been happier in his entire life. He caught Storm mid-leap as the pup tried to launch himself at the bookshelf, earning an indignant yip. "Easy there, warrior. Save some of my furniture for tomorrow." Storm licked his face enthusiastically, and the other pups swarmed, climbing over each other to reach him, tiny claws digging into his clothes as they treated him like the world's best climbing tree. Serafina watched from the doorway, her expression soft with love and laughter and perfect contentment, and Kieran looked at her over the pile of wiggling pups and mouthed, "Help." She just smiled. "You're doing great, Alpha." Later, after they'd corralled the pups for their midday nap and restored some semblance of order to his office, Kieran stood in the nursery doorway watching 6 small bodies sleep in their pile of blankets. Serafina joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Everything that changed? Everything you gave up to protect us?" Kieran looked at her, this fierce, broken, beautiful woman who'd survived the unsurvivable, and then at the pups who'd stolen his heart before they'd even opened their eyes. "I found them frozen in the snow," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of everything that had happened, everything they'd overcome, everything they'd become. "And they became my heart." Serafina's fingers tightened around his. "Forever?" "Forever," Kieran promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Thank you for listening to another emotional, magical shifter romance here on Tina Romance Library. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, heart-gripping romance stories.